Jace is one of Magic's 5 original Planeswalkers from Lorwyn, and he's gone on to be a big part of Magic lore, such a big part of it that he has 15 Planeswalker cards now. And because they tend to be so powerful, there are already more than enough for us to do an MTG Top 10 dedicated to Jace Planeswalkers, and that's what we're doing today, with a look at the 10 Jace Planeswalkers that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. I use a scoring system where cards are awarded 2 points for first tier top 8s, like Pro Tours, and 1 point for second tier top 8s, like regional championships. At number 10, it's Jace Cunning Castaway. This Jace, from Ixalan, is trying out a career as a pirate. For 1 generic and 2 blue, he comes with 3 loyalty, and he has a +1 that lets you draw a card, and then discard a card when 1 or more of your creatures does combat damage to a player that turn, a -2 that makes a 2/2 illusion token that gets sacrificed when it becomes a target of a spell, and a -5 that makes 2 tokens that are copies of Jace, but they aren't legendary. So the +1 can be pretty good when you're ahead, since it digs you deeper into your deck when you can attack effectively. The -2 can be good when you're behind, because it gives you a body that can protect Jace, and the ultimate is really strong too, as you suddenly get access to those other 2 loyalty abilities up to 3 times a turn. One notable thing about this Jace is that Ixalan was the set where Planeswalkers first had the legendary super typing, so they used this particular Jace to talk about the rule change because of that ultimate. This Jace never caught on in a big way in Constructed, unlike most other non-Planeswalker deck Jaces. He just doesn't have the same value engine potential as the others, nor does he have an ability that feels really strong the turn he comes down. His points all came in mono blue tempo decks in Standard, and he hasn't put up any top 8s since then. At number 9, it's Jace Reawakened. This is the most recent Jace, having been printed in Thunder Junction earlier this year, and it was the first time we saw Jace after the war with Phyrexia. This card revealed he was still alive and no longer Phyrexianized. Anyway, this Jace costs 2 blue and starts with 3 loyalty, but he can't be cast during your first, second, or third turns of the game. And that's a good thing, because he'd be pretty nuts if you could drop him on 2. His first +1 draws you a card and then you discard a card. His second +1 lets you exile a non-land card with mana value 3 or less from your hand, and if you do, it becomes plotted, which means you can cast it at a later turn without paying any mana for it. And he's got a -6 that copies your spells for the rest of your turn. That second +1 can be particularly potent since it gives you such a big discount on a card, even if you do have to wait a turn to actually play it. While this Jace hasn't found a home in Standard, he's already seen play in the non-rotating formats, namely Pioneer and Modern, and in both cases it's being played in decks that can abuse that second +1. In Pioneer, it's being used in control decks to cheat Tibalt Cosmic Imposter into play. You do this by plotting the Valky side, but then casting the Planeswalker side when you go to cast it on your next turn. It does the same thing in Modern, but in that format you can also plot Ancestral Vision. Normally you have to wait a long time to draw those 3 cards, but you only have to wait a turn if you plot it with Jace. Jace Reawakened is good at abusing powerful cards, so it's likely to gain more points in the future, and some of the Jaces in front of it have been inactive for a while, so it has a chance to move up. At number 8, it's Jace Unraveler of Secrets. This Jace is from Shadows over Innistrad, and he's investigating the origins of all the weird stuff that's happening on the plane. Spoiler alert, it's the Eldrazi. For 3 generic and 2 blue, he starts with 5 loyalty, has a +1 that scries 1 and then draws you a card, a -2 that bounces a creature, and a -8 that gives you an emblem that says, whenever an opponent casts his or her first spell each turn, counter that spell. So if you're ahead of your opponent when he comes down, you'll probably be using his +1 to gain even more of an advantage as a result of card draw. If you're a little behind, you'll probably bounce an opposing creature. And even if you are behind, he will usually be able to bounce a couple of things before going down, and that's not terrible for the mana investment. And if he's left unchecked and can use that +1 all he wants, he eventually makes an emblem that counters the first spell your opponent casts each turn, which has got to be one of the most frustrating emblems to play against. This Jace gained all of its points in Standard, where it was played in control decks, but it also picked up a few points in aggro decks like Azorius Flash and Collected Company. The Unraveler doesn't have any points since rotating out of Standard, though. The first few Jaces on this list haven't had the most impressive scores, but the rest of the list is on a whole other level, with all of them having 41 or more points, including the number 7 card that has exactly that many, and that card is Jace Memory Adept. This Jace was originally printed in Magic 2012, only the third Jace ever. This one costs 3 generic and 2 blue and starts with 4 loyalty. He's got a +1 that draws you a card and puts the top card of target player's library into the graveyard, a 0 ability that mills the top 10 cards of a library, and a -7 that draws any number of target players 20 cards. While we haven't seen it on the 3 Jaces we've seen so far, Jace often does have abilities that can mill players out. And that's certainly what we have going on here, as every single one of Jace Memory Adept's loyalty abilities contribute to you winning the game by getting rid of your opponent's library. For example, that 0 ability can mill the opponent out in 4 or 5 turns. This Jace was printed in Magic 2012, Magic 2013, and Magic 2014, giving him several years of standard legality, and he saw some play in each of those standard formats. At first, he was played in decks like Blue-White Delver and Esper Control, and near the end of his time in Standard, he was played in Devotion to Blue and Blue-White Control. Jace is unlikely to see play again outside of Standard, but he did enough while he was there that it seems likely he sticks around on this list for a while. At number 6, it's Jace the Perfected Mind. This Jace is from Phyrexia All Will Be One, and it's from the time when he was completed. For 2 generic, a blue, and a blue Phyrexian mana, he starts with 5 loyalty, and he comes with Completed, which means you can choose to pay 2 life or a blue mana for the 1 Phyrexian mana, and if you pay life, he enters with 2 fewer loyalty. In other words, you can play him as a 3 mana 3 loyalty Planeswalker that you pay 2 life for, or a 4 mana 5 loyalty Planeswalker. He's got a +1 that makes it so a creature has -3/-0 until your next turn, a -2 that mills 3 cards, and then if a graveyard has 20 more cards in it, you draw 3 cards, otherwise you only draw 1, and he's got a -X that mills 3 times X cards. His +1 is pretty good at protecting him, and protecting him is important because that -X can mill the opponent out in a big way if your opponent can't lower his loyalty. This has made him a good win condition in control decks in multiple formats, including Standard, Pioneer, and Modern. In Pioneer, it also sees play in Dimir Rogue decks, which often have many other ways to mill the opponent, and it also sees play in a dedicated mill deck in Modern. One of the best mill win conditions ever, Jace the Perfected Mind is going to keep on gaining points going forward and has a good shot at moving up the list. At number 5, it's Jace Beleren, the original Jace, and one of the original 5 Planeswalkers from Lorwyn. He costs 1 generic and 2 blue, and he's got a +2 that draws both players a card, a -1 that draws target player a card, and a -10 that mills 20 cards. He has also benefited from numerous reprintings. After Lorwyn, he was printed in Magic 2010 and Magic 2011. As a result, it's had a lot of time in Standard, and he definitely took advantage, seeing lots of play in midrange and control decks. While this Jace is powerful in its own right, part of the reason it saw play was because of how Planeswalker rules worked at the time. Back when Planeswalkers debuted, there was something called the Planeswalker Uniqueness Rule. While Planeswalkers weren't legendary yet, they did institute a rule to make them feel like unique individuals, and they did this by making it so that only 1 Planeswalker per Planeswalker type could be on the battlefield. This meant that if another Planeswalker with the Jace type entered the battlefield while Jace Beleren was in play, both of them went into the graveyard, even when they were controlled by different players. This became important because the most powerful Jace of all time shared Standard with it for a while, and Jace Beleren was cheaper, so you could use it to block this super powerful Jace, who we'll see further up on the list. Jace Beleren hasn't gained any points though since 2017. At number 4, it's Jace Wielder of Mysteries. This Jace is from War of the Spark, the first set to feature non-mythic Planeswalkers after the introduction of the mythic rarity, and the first set to give Planeswalkers abilities apart from loyalty abilities. He costs 1 generic and 3 blue and comes with 4 loyalty. He's got a +1 that mills 2 cards and you draw a card, and a -8 that draws 7 cards, and if your library has no cards in it, you win the game. Jace's other ability is a replacement effect that says if you would draw a card while your library has no cards in it, you win the game instead. So in other words, this Jace is definitely more about milling you than your opponent, since he has a couple of different ways to win the game when you do it. Unsurprisingly, this Jace has gained all of its points in decks seeking to win the game by doing exactly that. It didn't see a ton of play in Standard, but Pioneer was a format where he could really be abused. There, it helped spawn the format's first truly broken deck, Dimir Inverter. This deck sought to use Inverter of Truth to get rid of the library, and then you could either use Thassa's Oracle or Jace to win the game. With both Jace and the Oracle, the deck was surprisingly consistent, and ultimately, the Inverter was banned out of the format in 2020. While it doesn't see quite as much play as the Oracle, which is easier to win the game with, the Wielder has gone on to some success in multiple formats alongside alongside Thassa's Oracle, including Legacy Doomsday. It's also seen play in decks that don't use the Oracle, like Pioneer, Arclight, Phoenix decks, which are more interested in drawing cards and quickly loading the graveyard than they are in winning the game by milling out their whole library. It's slowed down in Pioneer of late, but Jace Wielder of Mysteries probably isn't done putting up top finishes. At number 3, it's Jace Architect of Thought. This Jace is from Return to Ravnica, and it costs 2 generic and 2 blue for a 4 loyalty Planeswalker. He's got a +1 that makes it so your opponent's creatures get -1/-0 when they attack until your next turn, a -2 that reveals your top 3, and an opponent separates those cards into 2 piles. One pile goes in your hand, the other pile goes to the bottom of your library. He's also got a -8 that lets you search each player's library for a non-land card and exile it, and then you can cast those cards without paying their mana costs. That +1 is great at protecting him, the -2 is good at netting you cards, and if you get to the ultimate, you're usually going to win by casting the strongest spell out of your deck and your opponent's. As you can imagine, this Jace is very well suited for control decks, which is exclusively where it was played in Standard and Modern. More recently, it's seen a tiny bit of play in Pioneer, where he picked up a top 8 in a blue-white control deck. This Jace is largely inactive at this point though, and the more active Jaces on the list, like the Perfected Mind and Wielder of Mysteries, are likely to pass it in the future. At number 2, it's Jace Vryn's Prodigy. This Jace doesn't start out as a Planeswalker, but like the other Magic Origins Planeswalkers, he's a creature that can become a Planeswalker, and the card is meant to represent the moment that Jace's spark ignited. For 1 generic and a blue, he's a 0/2, and you can tap him to draw and then discard, and then if your graveyard has 5 or more cards in it, he transforms into Jace Telepath Unbound, a 5 loyalty Planeswalker that has a +1 that gives a creature -2/-0 until your next turn, a -3 that lets you cast an instant or sorcery from your graveyard, and a -9 that gives you an emblem that mills 5 cards every time you cast a spell. So it takes a little bit of work, to be sure, but you end up getting a 2-mana Planeswalker, and it's a pretty formidable one. Flip Jace has been particularly well suited to decks that can quickly load the graveyard, and or are interested in doing stuff with spells. He's seen significant play in every single format he's ever been legal in, as there are decks in just about every format that can quickly transform him. Jace Vryn's Prodigy is going to keep on gaining points in the future, but that's true for the card in front of it too, which also happens to have a massive lead. And that card is, of course, Jace, the Mind Sculptor. While we're used to getting insanely pushed Planeswalkers today, Jace the Mind Sculptor was the first time where one felt truly broken. And for a long time, it was considered the most powerful Planeswalker ever printed. These days, it's been surpassed by cards like Oko, Thief of Crowns, and Minsk and Boo, among others, but it's still in the conversation as one of the best Planeswalkers of all time. He costs 2 generic and 2 blue and starts with 3 loyalty. One of the great things about this Jace is that he sports 4 loyalty abilities, not something a lot of Planeswalkers get, especially at 4 mana. His +2 lets you look at the top card of target player's library, and you can choose to put that card on the bottom of that player's library. This ability is surprisingly powerful, as it can allow you to lock your opponent out of drawing useful cards, while ticking up Jace's loyalty in a big way. His 0 ability is effectively Brainstorm. In other words, you draw 3 and then put 2 cards from your hand back on top. Brainstorm is one of the most powerful cards in all of Magic, and Jace can just fire it off every turn without lowering his loyalty. It's also got a -1 that bounces a creature, which can come in handy when you're behind, and he's got a -12 that exiles an entire player's library and then they shuffle their hand into their library. So it completely disarms them and puts them in top deck mode with very few cards left to draw. So yeah, you can see why Jace the Mind Sculptor is completely insane, and this was especially true in Standard, where it was a staple that helped make Cobblade decks one of the most dominant Standard decks of all time, and it got banned after only being in Standard for about a year as a result. And when the Modern format was created, Jace was preemptively banned there, so he couldn't gain points there between 2011 and 2018, when he did get unbanned in the format. These days, he actively sees play in Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, and that's not going to stop anytime soon. Maybe Oko Thief of Crowns is better, but Jace the Mind Sculptor has been doing it for a lot longer, and has really stood the test of time. Jace the Mind Sculptor is likely to remain the #1 Jace for the rest of eternity. So those are the best Jace Planeswalkers. If you're interested in getting your hands on these powerful cards, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past videos, including others that look at Planeswalkers, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.